Hello, everybody. We get to talk about Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion today, and I am absolutely thrilled about that because this is one of the very few games that bear the Final Fantasy name that I've never actually had the chance to play. I don't know why that's the case. I have had plenty of opportunities to get into it, but I've never quite managed to find the time to do so. That all changes now, thankfully, because of this remaster, remake, or whatever you want to call it. I have had an excuse to pick it up and finally play it. In this preview stage, I've been able to play through the first 3 chapters, and that has given me a good sense of both the gameplay and narrative, and I've walked away really impressed with both. For what seems like a simple remaster that Square Enix has thrown at us right at the end of the year, when they likely had no real expectations for how it would go in the market, this game really is impressive. In a year with a lot of very big, very impressive JRPGs, this one still manages to stand out and demand your attention. Now, because I've never played the original, I cannot compare and contrast, so I'm not going to be doing that in this video or my future review or anything else. I am sure that Square has made some changes to the base game. The description says that there have been changes to the combat systems, the graphics, and so on. I do not know what those really are. I've never actually even seen Crisis Core being played in any version before, so I really cannot make that comparison. However, what I can say is that in a lot of ways, this game feels very modern to play, not what I expected, knowing that it was a PSP title. There are some bits where the PSP heritage is clear, and we will talk about that in the video, but in terms of the overall experience and how it feels to play, the way it is presented, if I hadn't have known it was a PSP title originally, I would have just assumed that it was a relatively low budget spin-off game instead. So for a start, as you can see from the footage, this is a really impressive experience visually. The highlight is definitely the summons. I've seen 2 of them so far. I don't know how many are in total, but I have seen Ifrit and Bahamut, and they are both truly vintage Final Fantasy stuff. And I loved it. They reminded me of Final Fantasy VIII or X's summons with these big, lengthy, earth-shattering attacks that came from monsters that were relatively traditional-looking beasts. Ifrit is this big fire demon, Bahamut is a dragon. I have felt that later Final Fantasy games got a little overwrought with the detail with these summons, and they looked a little less traditional than I think I would like for kind of these massive beasts, but this game nails the aesthetic that I do love to see with my summons. And that goes back to my earlier games, I guess. The first Final Fantasy game that I truly deeply loved was probably Final Fantasy VIII. And that game is really quite famous for the number of amazing summons attacks that it had. And this game took me back to that. So that was nice to see. Outside of the battles, things do look nice as well. Surely there has been some significant upgrades here, because the characters have details that would just have been impossible on the PSP, like some really nicely flowing hair in cutscenes. And the level of detail in the environments and the enemies is also very impressive. It's certainly not Final Fantasy VII Remake level impressive, and given that I'm playing this on the PlayStation 5, the difference is noticeable and it is there. But as an aesthetic experience, I was still immediately drawn into Crisis Core. I could see the Final Fantasy VII-ness of it all, and that is impressive because I was expecting this to be a simple up-resolution to PSP game, and it really outdid my expectations visually. What has had me really hooked, though, is actually the storytelling. Again, I went in expecting a PSP game, which I've played a lot of PSP RPGs, and that would have meant a certain efficiency to the plotting that would have left it lacking in some of the nuance of the bigger blockbuster RPGs of today. I really love the PSP as a console and a lot of the RPGs that were on it, but with only a few exceptions such as the Legend of Heroes game and whatever, the narrative of these games was never the kind of console-like quality that we've kind of come to expect. There was always an efficiency about it. They were great, but they didn't go into the kind of depth that I like from my RPGs these days. But this game has a lot more than I was expecting. The performances themselves were good. There is a really likable and interesting blend of characters. that mix humor and more serious plot points in a way that I've seen done as well as any other Final Fantasy game. The overarching narrative is the real star of the show, though. Right from the start, it is challenging players, asking them to question the morality and righteousness of what they're doing with their missions. And of course, Final Fantasy VII and the remake were both sincerely probing games themselves. And if you've played either of them, then you already know about the soldier faction that you're fighting for in Crisis Core, at least so far. But this one hits the ground running, even in comparison to those, almost immediately highlighting that the war campaigns that you're on are questionable, to say the least. And that sets up a really intriguing plot that I cannot wait to go further into. And I mean, one of the reasons that I have loved Final Fantasy for as long as I have, and I have been playing this series for as long as I've been playing JRPGs, it's because they always do ask questions of the players and actually dare them to think. They respect players' intelligences. And sometimes this does backfire and they go a bit too far. So, for example, the 3 Final Fantasy XIII games were actually incredibly intelligent in their narrative and storytelling, but it was almost too much so. Your experience of those games is definitely enhanced by having experience in philosophy and art criticism and that kind of deconstruction of text. And for a blockbuster series, it is a risk to make that assumption of everybody that's going to play the thing. And as a result, there was a lot of people that didn't really get along with the plot of the Final Fantasy XIII games. But I would rather Square Enix err on the side of being too smart and exploring themes like determinism and moral relativism and imperialism and all the rest of that, rather than be too simple and end up producing things like God of War. Crisis Core, at least at this stage, and please don't ruin the plot for me in the comments as I really don't know what's coming next, does seem to be pretty fiercely anti-imperialist and anti-military in a way, or at least a questioning of the way that military systems work. And I very much want to see how all of this plays out. Over on the gameplay side of things, we can see the PSP heritage of the game a little bit more. Now, I don't mean that in terms of the combat itself, and I do believe that Square Enix has updated this to make it more action-based, and it does play really nicely. Your character has some very fluid combos, and there's plenty of depth in the materia system. The slot machine mechanic, which as far as I can tell is pretty unique to JRPGs, and it's an interesting one in this game, because what it means is that while you might have some really powerful summons at your disposal, as well as special attacks that can win a battle almost outright, you'll never quite know when you'll be able to access them. You have to rely on the slot machine, which spins automatically and continually to pop up with a good result, so you can summon, for example, Ifrit, or use one of your overdrive attacks or whatever. This is a really great system because it forces you to rely on your own abilities and standard attacks, rather than simply spam your way through with the most powerful things that you have at your disposal. That is something that a lot of RPGs struggle with. How do they get people to use the full range of their combat abilities after they get access to some really powerful stuff? Crisis Core here really does a good job of showing a solution to that. And I loved it. I really have enjoyed every combat because the randomness of that slot machine means that you are forced to really rely on everything that you have access to at that time. It plays very nicely, in other words. It's certainly limited in that you can't play as a party of heroes, and that did, at least at first, throw me a little bit, that I was the only character out there for a Final Fantasy game. That's fairly unusual. But once I got over that, and despite the frequency with which the combat comes, because it is very frequent, it has never been tiring. I have enjoyed every single battle I've played along the journey. No, but where it does feel like there is the PSP heritage in there is that the areas to explore are quite tiny. And the way that the game is structured is also quite tiny. Story missions do run on for a little bit longer, but also do still involve moving around some fairly small areas. And outside of those missions, things get even more limited in that the only other thing you can really do, at least so far, is take on some side quests from a menu, which will drop you in a tiny map where you'll have to fight just a couple of battles before you've claimed victory and you get your reward. So those only take a minute or two. And the benefit of that is that the flow from mission to mission is great and you can get a lot done in a fairly small amount of time. But it does feel like a very PSP era way of handling an epic JRPG. But I don't criticize. Absolutely not criticizing this game on any level. My favorite PSP game that I did actually play at the time that I had the PSP was White Knight Chronicles. And it was very much like this game. You had very small playable areas, lots of menu-driven mission structures, and a relatively narrow focus in terms of the drive of the game. What sets Crisis Core apart from White Knight Chronicles, and the reason I've loved it even more, I think, is that it has that exceptional narrative, that amazing characterization, and the sheer quality of everything that it does. Plus the fact that for a remaster or remake or whatever you want to call it, there's obviously a lot of work that has gone into this one. It's really, really impressive stuff. So I love that. Anyway, that's enough of my video. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some footage of this game in action. I am absolutely loving it, like I think you can tell from the video. I can't wait to write my full review, which will be fairly soon. But in the meantime, do let me know your own thoughts in the comments. Did you play the original on PSP? Did you love it enough that you are looking forward to picking this one up? Is this going to be, like for me, your first time playing the game? What are your expectations of it? Let's have a good chat about the game. If you've enjoyed this video, then please do consider following us and subscribing. That way you will see each video as it pops up. And if you do want to support us further, including the huge amount of work we do on digitallydownloaded.net in terms of all our written reviews and stuff, the magazine that we produce, the podcast, and all the rest of it. If you want to support us, then please do back us on Patreon. You can do so for $1 a month or more if you're feeling generous, and that in return for that, you do get the magazine as part of your subscription. So on that note, I'll head off. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.